Thank you, Professor Reddy, for this opportunity, and hello to everyone who's online and participating in this seminar. As Professor Reddy said, I'm going to present on the development and use of a low-power wireless urban soil sensing network for stormwater management. The work that I'm going to present was recently published in an paper that is open access, and so at the end of this webinar, I'm going to share the link so that you can have access to the research that I'm presenting and get a little bit more understanding in depth about the work. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to present is part of Hawkeye Zhao's PhD work. Hawkeye successfully defended his civil engineering PhD at Columbia University in January of this year under my supervision, and he's now a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. But Hawkeye collaborated very closely with Kevin Kam, who's an electrical engineering PhD student at Columbia University, on setting up the sensor network that I'm presenting. Kevin actually successfully defended his PhD in May of this year, and he's working at Apple. John Kamissis, an electrical engineering professor at Columbia University, was Kevin's PhD advisor. And Brian Mayu, who's a professor of environmental science and co-chairs the environmental science department at Barnard College, oversaw a lot of the field work I'm going to describe. The work was partly sponsored by the National Science Foundation and Verizon. Here's an outline of what I'm planning to present during this webinar. I'm going to start off with the motivation for the work. I'll describe the soil sensing network, including the components of the system. I'm going to provide some example monitoring data, and then I'll let you know how we use the data to predict stormwater runoff at our monitoring sites. And then I'll wrap up with some conclusions and what we're thinking of doing in the near future. So the motivation. Soils provide many ecosystem services, as illustrated by this diagram. Some include climate regulation, nutrient cycling, flood mitigation, and foundation support. However, despite the importance of soils to our environment and human flourishing, their health and how that feeds into the many ecosystem services that they provide is currently understudied. And that's especially true for urban soil systems, which are actually very complicated soil systems. In many cases, if we look at how we characterize soil systems, and including urban soil systems, we actually use sampling, invasive sampling techniques, or observational techniques. If we can actually, and in cases of urban soils, they're actually often characterized by their land use. In urban greening, which is something I'm very interested in, for example, assumptions about the ecosystem services that soils provide regarding things like flood mitigation are often based on the nature of the vegetated cover and not on the characteristics of the soil beneath. If we can actually improve understanding of urban soil characteristics and health, we might be able to improve how we manage urban soils for our benefit and that of the environment. Personally, my own interest in urban soils, including engineered soils, is the role that they play in supporting urban greenery, mitigating stormwater runoff, and the urban heat island effect. Because to date, most of the focus on understanding urban soil health has involved sampling or observational data, there really is a dearth of understanding of what feeds into urban soil health, which means that we are not really managing the health of our urban soils at this point in time in ways that could maximize the ecosystem services that they provide. So in recognition of this, the National Science Foundation actually introduced a program, which they called Signals in the Soils, SITS, about 5 years ago to promote the development of sensor systems and modeling to advance our understanding of soil systems, including advancing our understanding of urban soil health. The collaborative work I'm going to present today in this webinar was partly funded by the NSF SITS program, and it actually involved the development of a low-power, long-range wireless communication system for real-time in-situ soil health and monitoring. The suite of soil sensing options that we aim to develop under this collaboration was quite extensive and includes sensing options beyond soil moisture and soil temperature, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, to include nutrient monitoring using optical methods that we've actually already quite successfully tested. To demonstrate the utility of the approach, we initially chose to focus on urban stormwater management issues, and you'll see what we did with the urban sensing data that we got to advance understanding of how urban soils and in this case, our focus green spaces can contribute to stormwater management. Before I move on to the sensing system, I wanted to give just a brief overview of urban stormwater management issues. Increased stormwater runoff in urban areas due to widespread imperviousness and wet weather flow, as illustrated here, leads to sewer overflows, both combined sewer overflows and single separate sewer overflows that contaminate local water bodies. And also it generates anything from nuisance to quite catastrophic flooding. Soils that underlie green spaces and green infrastructure can actually soak up wet weather flow, i.e. precipitation, and stormwater runoff, and thus reduce some of these impacts. And it is for this reason that I've personally been interested in understanding urban soil behavior and urban soil health with the goal of thinking about urban stormwater management as part of an urban sustainability challenge. The soil sensing system that we used in this work employed the use of LoRaWAN as a low-power, long-range wireless communication system. This is actually an open ecosystem that has long communication range, up to 5 kilometers in urban areas, and we demonstrated that with some field measurements that we did. It's got low power consumption, so it can run on batteries for extended periods, and it's quite easy to deploy. There are private LoRaWAN networks, but there are also public LoRaWAN networks. So it's actually a great backbone upon which to develop sensing systems that require long range and also require very, very many sensors. As shown in this diagram here, the end nodes, and in our case, these are soil sensing nodes, connect to a LoRaWAN gateway or multiple gateways, which then go to a network server. And from there, they can be passed to an application server to provide IoT decisions or decision support services. And there's end-to-end encryption in this transmission, which ensures data security and privacy. Because LoRaWAN has a low bandwidth, it's actually not useful for transmitting large files such as videos. So this is not an application that you use for a smart and connected vehicle solution to urban sustainability. But in the case of soil sensing networks, that's not a limitation for us. So we did not, the low bandwidth for us was actually useful because it enabled the lower power consumption. The sensing end node components that are in our system include the WAN microcontroller, so that allows the connection with the LoRaWAN gateway, and air temperature, air humidity, soil temperature, and soil moisture sensors. So this was our initial deployment of the sensing network. All of these components were hooked up to a custom designed sensor circuit board. And they were integrated into a weatherproofed node or sensor box. The sensor box was installed at each monitoring station in our network. Here it is schematically shown, installed on a tree. So this is the sensor box with all of the components integrated. Also schematically shown on this diagram are the soil sensors that we used, that were connected to the sensor box with wires and that were buried below the sensor box location. and the air temperature and humidity sensors, which were also deployed using wires and installed above ground. As you can see from the schematic, the signals from the sensors, which were collected every 15 minutes, were transmitted to a gateway, a LoRaWAN gateway. From there, they went to the Thing Network Cloud server, and this was encrypted transmission. From the TTN network server, they went to our own local database, and from our local database, we set up a data dashboard where we could monitor the output of the sensors in real time. So we deployed our monitoring system at 7 green spaces on Columbia University's Morningside campus. Columbia University's Morningside campus is located on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The 7 sites that we chose to deploy our sensing network across, which we referred to as nodes, are shown illustrated here in this aerial photograph, and pictures of each of the sites. The sites are shown to the right here. The sites included 4 what we call tree sites, 4 sensors at tree nodes, and 3 sensors at lawns. So you can see the above ground conditions at the tree sites look quite similar. The above ground conditions at least 2 of the lawn sites also look quite similar. In addition to installing the nodes, the node packages around the Columbia University campus, we also installed our own LoRaWAN gateway. And that's shown here. On the north side of the campus, this is a figure showing the LoRaWAN gateway installed at a rooftop on the north side of the campus. Having the LoRaWAN gateway on the campus actually provided adequate signal range for all of our sensors. And in addition to the gateway, we also installed a weather station on a roof at the north end of the campus to collect rainfall and other data that we needed to develop our stormwater management models. This slide here is an example of the sensing network dashboard. It displays the signals from all 4 sensors, the air humidity and air temperature sensors that were located at each node and were installed above ground, and the soil moisture and soil temperature sensors, which were located below ground. And so you can see at any time we can get a real-time readout of what's going on at all of the sensors across the 7 separate nodes which we instrumented on the Columbia University Morningside campus. Each of the 7 sensing nodes, although above ground conditions might look quite similar in some cases, had quite different subsurface conditions. And here I have a table describing the subsurface conditions, as well as the site description of the sensing node location itself. The soils were mainly loam soils, although some sites contained construction debris. Some of the soil layers at the sites were quite shallow and had structures below them, while others were a little bit deeper. We actually took samples at each site and did a sedimentation analysis to determine the soil sites. And the sand fractions at the sites ranged from 60% at node 4, which is located, illustrated here, to 14% at node 5, which is a loam site. So we gathered data from our sensing network for quite a long period of time. In fact, it's still operational now. But what I want to do is present data from a year of monitoring just to display some of the trends that we observed. And then we'll move on from there and describe how the data that we collected was fed into models that allowed us to predict stormwater management capacity at each of these 7 sites. So what you see here are box plots that show soil moisture trends at each of the sensing nodes, the nodes 1 to 7, defined as the volumetric water content. So the soil moisture or volumetric water content is on the vertical axis of these box plots, and the horizontal axis displays each of the separate nodes. And this is a monitoring period from May 2020 to May 2023. So if we look at the left-hand diagram, you can see that the lowest soil moisture observations over this entire year occurred at node 4. Node 4 is a tree site, and that's the node that has the highest fraction of sandy soil in our monitoring array. Conversely, the highest soil moisture contents, and it's this box plot up here, were seen at node 6. And node 6 is a lawn site that has quite a shallow soil depth. And that shallow soil depth is actually underlain by some subsurface infrastructure, which most likely is preventing drainage of any moisture that enters the soil to exit the base of the soil layer itself. We also used the monitoring data that we collected to examine seasonal trends of soil moisture over this particular year. And they're shown as the box plots on the right-hand side diagram. We saw anticipated seasonal variations at 3 nodes, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And we could do this just looking at node 1 here, these box plots here. By anticipated, we mean that we saw the lowest soil moisture during the summer season, this orange box plot here, the highest soil moisture during the winter season, as red box plot here, and intermediate soil moistures during the shoulder seasons, the fall and the spring. We would obviously anticipate the lowest soil moistures during the summer season due to evapotranspiration effects, and also because these are all vegetated sites, you know, the vegetation itself providing some type of interception of precipitation before it actually falls to the ground and adds to increased soil moisture content. You know, during the winter, you're not going to see much in terms of evapotranspiration. The vegetation will have died off, and so you would expect to see higher soil moistures. So at 3 of the nodes 1, 3, and 7, the seasonal variations were as you might anticipate. But we actually saw different behavior at other nodes, and we can look at node 2 as an example here and examine the seasonal trends here. At node 2, the spring, the blue box plot, and the summer, the orange box plot, soil moisture contents were the highest observed. And the lowest observed was during the fall and the winter. So sort of the antithesis of the seasonal trends that were observed at node 1. Okay, so the reason that we saw, I'm going to say, unanticipated seasonal variations at 4 of the nodes, 2, 4, 5, and 6, was due to irrigation outlets that were located close to the monitoring stations that actually operate during spring and summer on the campus. And so the additional irrigation was increasing the soil moisture at the sensing nodes where the irrigation outlets were most closely located. We can actually back out the local irrigation patterns using the air humidity readings that we have at each node that actually proved to be fairly reliable. Remember that we have a weather station, so we know what the rainfall patterns are. But when we see changes in air humidity that are not associated with rainfall events, we know that they are due to irrigation outlets. We did actually measure irrigation depths at some of the nodes manually. However, we don't have monitored irrigation depths at each node. And I'll explain why that was important in some of the model development that I'll present. So if we now move on to the different modeling approaches that we use to estimate stormwater runoff at each sensing node, using the data that we collected from our sensing network. There were two modeling approaches that we investigated, and I'm really going to present the outcome of this initial modeling approach. And this involved modeling the increase in the degree of soil saturation, defined here, DOS, after a storm. So the degree of soil saturation is the volumetric water content of the soil minus the residual water content. We assumed a residual soil moisture content, volumetric water content of 0.05 at each node, divided by the saturated soil moisture content minus the residual soil moisture content. We took the saturated soil moisture content as the highest that was recorded at any one of our nodes. To define an individual storm, we separated the rainfall data that we got from the weather station located on the north side of our sensing network, in other words, the north side of the Columbia University Morningside campus, by 6-hour dry periods. And that's a standard separation technique that is used by NOAA. And in all of the work that we've done on investigating the role of urban greenery, urban soils, urban green infrastructure in managing stormwater runoff in cities, we've always used this same separation technique, so we can compare results across studies. So the first modeling approach we used was very simple. We just assumed that the degree of soil saturation, the increase in the degree of soil saturation due to an individual storm was just a linear function of the rain depth, described here as the rain amount that fell during that storm. And the second model is just a little bit more sophisticated, but it also takes into account the initial degree of saturation of the soil at the node, as well as the amount of rain that fell during an individual storm. So again, this modeling approach is going to enable us, and I will present results, to back out runoff that occurs during an individual storm. The second modeling approach we used was a bit more sophisticated. That actually used Hydrus 1D, which is a one-dimensional unsaturated flow model that can predict changing soil moisture conditions over long time periods, given a time series of precipitation data. So the second approach basically enabled us, with the use of the Hydrus 1D model, to do a long-term prediction of soil moisture content over a time period, as long as we were able to put in the rainfall conditions at each site, which we got from the monitoring station on the roof. Now, Hydrus 1D requires 5 parameters to make predictions. It's the residual soil moisture content, which we assumed was 0.05 at each node, the saturated moisture content, which we got from the maximum reading at each node. So those conditions were set, but it also requires 3 other parameters. Alpha and N are what are known as Van Genotchen parameters. I'm not going to go into depth about Hydrus 1D. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you're interested. And the saturated soil conductivity at each site. To back out the 3 parameters, alpha, N, and KS, we took a subset of soil monitoring data at each site, and we fitted the model to the data at the site. And then we used the fitting parameters that we got from fitting a subset of the data to predict the behavior at the site over the longer time series. Now, the time series we used was November to February. This meant that we didn't have to take into account increases in soil moisture that were due to irrigation. So we didn't have to know the irrigation depth at each site during each irrigation event as an input to the HYDRIS model. If we had that information, we could actually do the HYDRIS prediction over the entire year. We do have ways to back out that information, but I'm not going to go into that during this particular webinar. But here's an example of the observational moisture contents, the orange, and the simulated moisture contents, the blue by HYDRIS once we're able to set the 5 parameters at node 2, and you can see that the model does a reasonable job at predicting the observed soil moisture content at the site. So the advantage of this approach versus the simpler modeling approach that I presented on the previous slide is that runoff can be predicted as a time series. So it doesn't have to be predicted based on an individual event. And we can actually take into account the intensity of the rainfall and not just the rain amount. The simple model that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on in the next slides really just uses the rainfall depth of each storm event and the soil moisture conditions to predict when stormwater runoff will occur. And that really enables us to understand the role of our instrumented green spaces in mitigating stormwater runoff. This more sophisticated approach will take into account the rainfall intensity because that's one of the input parameters to this model, as well as the rain depth, and will also predict at what time during an individual storm runoff might start occurring. One thing we can see, though, from this comparison of observed soil moisture and simulated soil moisture is that HYDRIS doesn't actually capture all of the complexities of the observations. In many cases, it underestimates the soil moisture content during a storm event, which means that it would actually underestimate the ability of that soil layer to capture storm water. And so there's still improvement to be made here. And what we're currently working on now is a machine learning approach that couples supervised learning with a physical modeling based approach like HYDRIS to see if we can accurately predict soil moisture and other parameters in real time at sensing nodes. Okay, so I'm going to go back to predicting the increase in degree of soil saturation with soil depths at the nodes. And so what I've plotted here on the vertical axis is the increase in degree of soil saturation, and on the horizontal axis, the rainfall amount associated with each individual storm. And these dots on each of the plots represent the individual storms that we backed out using our weather station and that dry weather separation period of 6 hours. And the dots are colored depending on the initial degree of saturation of the soil at the start of the rainfall event. So what the soil saturation degree level was before rainfall occurred. So you can see at some nodes, and I'll point out node 4, that's the, apologies, that's the tree site, which has the highest fraction of sandy soil underlaying the site. So at node 4, you can see that the increase in degree of saturation of the soil at that site is sensitive to the rainfall amount. You know, and there's quite a decent correlation between the rainfall amount of the storm and the increase in degree of saturation of the soil at that site as a result of the storm. Conversely, if you look at the node 5 and node 6 on the bottom row here, and I'll pick out node 6, there's very little sensitivity at that node to soil saturation and rainfall amount. So over quite a wide range of storm depths, you know, up to 75 mil, there's very little change in the increase in degree of saturation at that site. That site is actually a lawn site that has quite a shallow soil depth, and it's underlain by underground infrastructure, which is really preventing soil drainage. So what's happening at that particular site, and we'll see that on the next slide that I present, is that the soil is already quite saturated because it's not able to drain between storms. So when the storm comes along, because the soil is already quite highly saturated, there's very little increase in saturation associated with the soil at that site, which means that most of the rainfall on that site is turning into runoff because there's no ability for the soil at that particular site to soak up the rainfall and manage the stormwater flow. So the next slide I'm going to present is a second model that just looks at how the degree of saturation of a soil at a particular site increases, not only just due to rain amount, but also based on the initial degree of saturation of the soil at the site before the rainfall event occurred. So what we plotted here is the initial degree of saturation on the vertical axis, the rainfall amount associated with each individual storm on the horizontal axis, and the contours that are shown in this plot represent the increase in degree of saturation associated with each of these conditions. Now, based on our observations, we assumed that runoff at each of our sites occurs when the degree of saturation at a site actually reaches about 90%. So a 0.9 value. And that's the intercept you see here. When there's no rainfall amount and the initial DOS is 0.9, then you're going to get runoff straight away. I'm sorry, I'm using the mouse and it seems to be sensitive to moving the slides at the same time. So this dashed red line that you see on each of these contour plots represents a condition where the initial degree of saturation and the rainfall amount bring the soil saturation at the site to 90% and runoff occurs. So to the left-hand side of this dashed line, all conditions in this area here, and I'm trying to illustrate this with the mouse and node 1, represent conditions where runoff is not going to occur. So at node 1, as long as the initial degree of saturation and the rainfall amount fall in this zone, that is to the left-hand side of the dashed red line, runoff is not going to occur at the node 1 site. As soon as the initial degree of saturation of the soil at the site and the rainfall amount fall in the gray zone, which is to the right of that dashed line, you're going to get runoff at the site. You know, so these contour plots shown here at nodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, those 7 instrumented nodes in our soil sensing network, all describe the conditions under which runoff will and will not occur at each of these nodes. And you can see that despite the fact that the surface conditions at some of these nodes look quite similar, some of them are lawns, some of them are tree sites, the conditions under which runoff will occur at each of these nodes is quite different. And that's why it's important when we consider the role that urban greening and urban soils play in supporting urban sustainability efforts like the effective management of stormwater in our cities, that we don't just look at the surface conditions, that we really understand what's happening below the surface, i.e., what the soil conditions are. And I'm going to end and also explain that towards the end of my seminar, that it's also important for us to link the observations that we've made at each of these nodes to the health of the soil beneath the nodes. Because it's certainly possible that some of the nodes, I'm going to point out node 6, you can see node 6. Basically, node 6 is doing nothing to help manage stormwater runoff here. It's going to take very little rainfall amount at node 6 for you to get into that gray zone and generate runoff. But it's possible that the soil conditions at node 6 represent unhealthy soil conditions when it comes to nutrients, when it comes to carbon, when it comes to other conditions. And we might be able to improve the conditions at node 6 such that more runoff could be captured. At node 4, though, you can see that the conditions under which runoff is prevented are quite wide-ranging. Over quite wide-ranging initial degree of saturation conditions and quite large storm depths, node 4 is actually able to manage a lot of the stormwater that falls on that area and prevent it from becoming runoff. I just want to point out that the bottom right-hand diagram here, which says overall, actually represents the averaged conditions across all of these nodes. And you can think of it when you realize the monitoring spaces that we've chosen on the Columbia University's Morningside campus. You can think of this as a sort of a summary of how all of the green space integrated across the Columbia University campus contributes to stormwater management. So the overall is an average of all of the separate conditions that we see at each of the nodes. But I still want to emphasize that the ability of each of the nodes, even though they all represent green spaces on the Columbia University Morningside campus, to capture storm water is quite varied. And that is shown on this table here. We actually used the model that I just presented on the previous slide to estimate runoff coefficients. And runoff coefficients are the ratio of runoff to rainfall, with 0 being no runoff and 1 being all the rainfall turns into runoff at each of the nodes for different soil depths over the course of the 1-year observations. And you can see on this table the different rain depths that we grouped the events into, the number of events that were associated with each of the rain depth groups. As is typical in New York City, the majority of rain events that occur fall within the group of 0 to 10 millimeters rainfall depth. We did observe some big storms, 50 plus millimeters, but the number of big storms we observed over the course of the year was obviously quite low. The total rainfall amount that we observed over the year was about 1.3 meters. That's very close to the average annual precipitation that we see in New York City. So in terms of precipitation, the actual observational year that I'm presenting with you is sort of a typical precipitation year for New York City. Okay, so we can look at the runoff coefficients at the different nodes. And if you look at node 6, you can basically see that for any rainfall depth, the runoff coefficient is close to 1. That means all of the rainfall that falls on that green space immediately turns into runoff. So again, emphasizing that that green space really is not performing much in the way of stormwater management. Whereas you look at node 4, which is the tree site that has the highest fraction of sandy soil at that site, that's really capturing a lot of the rainfall for quite large events. However, if you average all of the behavior across the 7 observational nodes that were part of our sensing network, you can see that the runoff coefficient for the urban campus green spaces ranges from 0.275 at the small rain depths to 0.571 as the storm size increases. And this is above the normal runoff coefficient range reported for green spaces in the literature. The runoff coefficient range reported for green spaces in the literature is generally 0.15 to 0.25. So it's pretty clear that the complexity of the soil conditions in urban spaces, might lead to the fact that these urban green spaces are not capturing rainfall at the rate that we assume they are. And there is an opportunity, as I said earlier, to better manage the soils beneath these urban green spaces to see if we can improve on this condition. I just now want to compare some of the data that we gathered from this urban sensing network to other data that we've gathered at different sites. We've actually been using monitoring and modeling methods to estimate runoff coefficients for urban greenery in New York City for close to 15 years now. So we have some very large data sets. And what I thought it might be helpful for the purpose of this webinar is to compare the findings from this particular study, which I've called Urban Campus, and it's represented as the blue bars in this plot, which shows the runoff coefficient on the vertical axis and the different storm sizes, storm depths on the horizontal axis, to two sites that involved green roofs. And green roofs are a common way of introducing greenery into dense urban environments with the purpose of stormwater management. However, they do involve quite shallow soil depths. So one of these green roofs is a cedar mat green roof system. It's got 32 millimeters of soil. It's an engineered soil. The other is a deeper system. It's 100 millimeters of soil. It's still an engineered soil. The vegetation is more native than sedum. But you can see in all cases, the ability of these soil systems to manage stormwater decreases with storm size. That's totally intuitive. I don't think any of us is surprised by that. But if you compare the urban campus green spaces with the green roofs, you can see that the green roofs really manage storms quite well that are 20 millimeters or below. But when you get to the larger storms, they're not as good as managing the stormwater runoff and soaking up local precipitation as these urban campus green spaces are. But when you get up to storms that are 50 millimeters plus, and really they're the storms in New York City that cause this severe flooding, none of these green spaces is doing what we need to prevent that flooding from occurring. So if we really want to actively promote the use of urban soils and urban greenery, for ecosystem services that speak to flood mitigation, we're going to have to really think about more active promotion of soil health and soil drainage. If soils and greenery are to become a useful component of urban flood protection. Okay, I've got a couple more slides that really summarize the conclusions we reached with this work and some of the future work we're doing. But before I move on to those, I actually wanted to highlight the fact that I and my collaborators have been monitoring the urban soils, including engineered soils that support urban greenery and green infrastructure in New York City for over 15 years. We monitored green roofs. I showed you some of the data we got from that on the previous slide. We've monitored tree pit soils. We've monitored soils in urban green streets. We've monitored soils in right-of-way bioswales, sometimes referred to as rain gardens. And we monitored soils that support vine canopies. We've also done some Internet of Things work involving the active control of rainwater collection systems. But in all cases, except this particular one that I've just presented during this webinar, we've actually been using cellular connections and on-site monitoring and sampling to understand the soil conditions and to develop models that allow us to predict how each of these greenery and soil systems can contribute to stormwater management, with a particular focus on New York City in our case. This is the first project I've been involved in that involves the LoRaWAN application, and also a close collaboration with electrical engineers to help develop new sensing capacity for soil nutrient content and other measurements, such as dissolved oxygen and pH that are important to soil health. I personally think this area has great promise for monitoring and understanding soil health across very large city areas, including under changing conditions. There's also the capacity for IoT applications to be added to this system at scale. IoT applications are already in place in some cities for stormwater management, as well as real-time flood alert systems. So we already know the utility of pursuing this approach. So I'm actually quite excited to be able to pivot a lot of the monitoring that I and my collaborators are already engaged in to this LoRaWAN platform. And we only added 7 sensing nodes across the Columbia University campus to demonstrate proof of concept for this. But the gateway that has been installed on the Columbia University campus has the capacity to handle very, very many more soil sensing nodes, as well as sensing nodes for other environmental conditions, including air quality, for example. So if we move on to the conclusions, so we did develop the LoRaWAN-based environmental sensing system as part of this work, and we deployed it at 7 quite diverse urban green spaces for over a year. We're obviously far from the first people to use the LoRaWAN platform for environmental sensing, and the paper, whose link I'll share at the end of this seminar, does some literature review of what has already been done in this area. I think our deployment for over a year probably is more extensive than some of the other research deployments that we've seen in this area, at least for environmental sensing. And as I said, we're pretty excited by this as a platform, and we think it has a lot to offer in general when it comes to urban environmental sensing and developing data that can be used for decision support systems, as well as can be integrated into IoT applications. As I showed, the soil moisture levels varied quite significantly across the monitoring sites. They were influenced by vegetation types, although the surface vegetation at some of the sites was quite similar. But the soil types and the conditions and the physical settings also fed into changing soil moisture levels, as well as seasonal changes at some of the sites, particularly the sites that weren't near irrigation nodes. We used a linear regression model that just had rainfall depth and initial soil moisture as inputs to predict the stormwater runoff at each of the sites, which were demonstrated as the contours. That model can actually be used to predict runoff in advance of a storm because the initial soil moisture is available through the network, and it's quite easy to couple that model to rainfall depth predictions that are readily available in many areas, including New York City. And this is my final slide. This is the future work that we're doing. We actually want to extend the current analyses using the existing data that we have to examine linkages between the soil moisture, the evapotranspiration at each soil site, and air temperature. This is going to enable us to really understand how urban soil systems and greeneries can contribute to reducing the urban heat island effect. This is an effect that's actually pretty understudied, and I think there are a lot of assumptions being made about the role of urban greenery in reducing urban heat islands that really need to be backed by quantitative data, and we actually have the quantitative data to at least examine these relationships on the Columbia University campus with respect to their green spaces. We're adding more sensors to measure soil biological and chemical conditions, because I think we need to link the behaviors that we've seen to soil health and really think, can we actively and better manage urban soil health to realize some of the ecosystem services that soils can bring to us in cities. And we're also quite interested in extending the network to include monitoring of urban green sites undergoing restoration. I've got a diagram here, which is a restoration that's going on in Riverside Park, where they have a lot of invasive species, but they also have soil erosion, which is leading to unstable embankments on that park. And they're trying to use goats to control this problem. And so there's a real opportunity there to put in a nice soil sensing network and understand how this vegetation, invasive vegetation and other things, because the goats are obviously compacting the soil, can improve soil conditions at that particular restoration site. So I'm happy to take questions. Here's the DOI of the article that I mentioned. It's just recently been published. I and my collaborators are making every effort we can to ensure that our publications are universally available and not behind a firewall. If you go to my ResearchGate site, I've tried to put preprints up there when I can, if they're open access, but the final review of an article when it's not open access. So if anyone is interested in this work in general, hopefully you can access the outcomes, through the ResearchGate site. And so with that, I will finish and stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.